You're sitting in a cave. It's 50,000 BC. You hunted this morning, you ate, the sun is still up. You have maybe 6 hours until it gets dark, and the things that want to eat, you become significantly more confident. And you have absolutely nothing to do. No phone, no book, no podcast, no group chat where someone sends a meme and then 19 people respond with slightly different versions of the laughing emoji. Just you, a rock, and the distant sound of wind. Here's the question nobody really asks about ancient humans. Not how did they survive, not what did they eat, not how did they make fire. Those are fine questions. We love those questions. But what about the hours in between? What did a person do in 50,000 BC when there was nothing left to do for the day? Did they just sit there staring at rocks? Did they go insane? Did some poor prehistoric man look up at the endless sky one afternoon and think, I am so incredibly, profoundly, existentially bored right now? The answer to that last one is almost certainly yes. And what he did next is genuinely more interesting than you'd expect. Let's start with the obvious question first. Could ancient humans even feel boredom? Because there's this assumption, I think, that boredom is a modern invention, that it's something that showed up when we built too much comfort into our lives and ran out of real problems to solve. That cavemen were too busy surviving to be bored. That assumption is wrong. Boredom isn't a luxury. It's a biological signal. Your brain generates the feeling of boredom the same way it generates hunger or pain. It's not a bug. It's a feature. It's your nervous system saying, hey, you're understimulated. Go find something more useful to do with yourself. What are you even doing right now? That signal didn't appear in the 21st century. It's ancient. Researchers who study the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, people whose daily lives give us probably the closest window we have into how ancient humans actually lived. They document boredom explicitly. The Hadza get bored. They have a word for it. They complain about it. If the Hadza get bored, Homo sapiens 50,000 years ago got bored. The feeling is as old as we are. The difference is what they did about it. Here's something that will make you feel genuinely terrible about your own productivity. Hunter-gatherers, on average, spend about 3 to 5 hours a day on what we'd call work. Hunting, gathering, preparing food, maintaining tools and shelter. 3 to 5 hours. For the rest of the day, they have what anthropologists, with complete scientific seriousness, call leisure time. The famous anthropologist Marshall Solins looked at this in the 1960s and came to a conclusion that sounds like a joke but isn't. He called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society. Not because they had a lot of stuff, they had almost nothing, but because they had extraordinary amounts of time. We have invented more labor-saving technology than any civilization in history, and most of us work 8, 9, 10 hours a day and still feel behind. They had sharp rocks and animal hides and somehow had more free time than we do. Think about that for as long as you need to. Now, what did they actually do with all that time? The single most common answer across every hunter-gatherer group ever studied is the same thing. They talked. Not practical talk. Not strategy meetings about the upcoming mammoth hunt. Just talking about people, about what happened, about what someone said to someone else and why that was annoying. About nothing in particular at all. Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist behind Dunbar's number, the idea that humans can only maintain about 150 stable social relationships at once. He spent years studying conversation patterns across different cultures. His finding was that something like 65% of human conversation is social gossip. Not information exchange, not planning, just people talking about other people. Who did what? Who's together with who now? Can you believe what she said yesterday? You didn't hear this from me, but 65,000 years before anyone invented tabloids, ancient humans had already figured out the exact same content. And Dunbar thinks this wasn't an accident. Language itself, he argues, might have evolved partly as a replacement for grooming. Chimpanzees bond by picking bugs off each other, which works, but it's slow and you can only groom one chimp at a time. Language let early humans maintain social bonds with an entire group simultaneously. You can talk to 5 people at once. You can't pick lice off 5 people at once, unless you're very coordinated, I suppose. But the deeper version of this wasn't just gossip. At night, around the fire, it became something else entirely. Story. Researchers studying the Kalahari Sand people documented that nighttime storytelling sessions could run for hours. Stories about hunts, about ancestors, about the stars and how they got there, about why the world works the way it does and what you're supposed to do about it. All of modern entertainment, every film and series and novel and podcast is a descended version of those stories. Same human need, same darkness surrounding the light, just different delivery mechanism. The campfire got bigger and somehow also fits in your pocket now. And here's the thing about those stories that most people miss. They weren't just entertainment, they were technology. Researchers who study the cognitive function of storytelling in hunter-gatherer groups have found something remarkable. Groups with better storytellers, people who could hold attention, build suspense, deliver a point, those groups showed higher levels of cooperation, higher levels of food sharing, better coordination during hunts. The person who could tell a good story wasn't just popular. They were valuable, survival level valuable. Which means sitting around telling stories wasn't the ancient version of wasting time. It was the ancient version of building the kind of social infrastructure that kept everyone alive. We turned it into Netflix. They used it to not die. The same basic impulse. Very different stakes. And one more thing about the talking. It wasn't just within the group. When 2 different groups of hunter-gatherers encountered each other, which happened, the first thing they did, almost universally, was talk, exchange information, who had been where, what they'd seen, where the game was moving, what the weather had been like 2 valleys over. This was intelligence gathering, real, practical, life or death information delivered through what looked like casual conversation. The most boring seeming activity, 2 groups of people sitting around chatting, was actually one of the most sophisticated information networks in the prehistoric world. Gossip as infrastructure. Conversation as survival technology. The office small talk you hate has very ancient roots and a much more serious original purpose than you'd ever guess. Here's the part people always get wrong about ancient humans. They assume that play was for children and adults just worked until they died. That is a very modern idea and it is incorrect. Hunter-gatherer adults play. They play a lot. Physical games, obviously. Running, wrestling, throwing things, jumping. If you've ever watched a group of adults at a party eventually end up playing some stupid competitive game they invented on the spot, congratulations, you've witnessed something that has been happening for at least 300,000 years. But also toys. In the archaeological record, going back tens of thousands of years, we find small, carved objects, smooth stones arranged in patterns, pieces that appear to be game components. We don't always know the exact rules. The rule book didn't survive, but the objects are there. Someone made them. Someone used them. Someone probably argued about whether that last move was legal. And music. The oldest known musical instrument is a bone flute found in Germany, carved from a vulture wing bone about 40,000 years old. 40,000 years. That's not an ancient instrument. That's an ancient instrument that already implies a musical tradition long enough to have developed an instrument. You don't carve a flute on the first day you have the idea of music. You carve a flute after years of humming and banging on things and realizing that you want to do this more precisely, which means the banging and humming goes back much further. And then there was dancing. Every human culture ever documented has dancing. No exceptions. Zero. The behavior is so universal that researchers treat it the same way linguists treat universal grammar. If it shows up everywhere, independently, across cultures that never had contact with each other, it isn't learned behavior. It's built in. Ancient humans danced around fires. Not in some mystical sacred ceremony sense, though that too, but also felt like it. Because rhythm feels good. Because moving together with other people feels good. Because sometimes you're bored and you start moving to a beat and then suddenly you're not bored anymore. This has been true for at least 50,000 years and probably much longer, and no amount of self-consciousness has ever fully stopped it from being true. But here's the detail about play that I find the most interesting. Play in hunter-gatherer groups is almost never purely individual. It's social. It involves other people. It requires participation, reaction, competition, cooperation. Even the games that look simple, throwing a rock at a target, seeing who can hold their breath the longest, chasing each other across open ground, they're all built around the same thing. Other people? Because boredom, for ancient humans, was rarely about having nothing to do in the abstract. It was about having nobody to do it with. The most dangerous form of boredom in a prehistoric context wasn't being understimulated, it was being alone. Isolation in the ancient world wasn't inconvenient, it was lethal. A person separated from their group had no one to help them if they got hurt, no one to share food during a bad hunting stretch, no one to watch their back while they slept. The brain's response to isolation and the brain's response to boredom actually share significant overlap in terms of neural pathways. Both are warning signals. Both say, this situation is dangerous, change it. Which is why, when you feel bored and reach for your phone to check if anyone has messaged you, you're not being weak or distracted. You're running a 300,000-year-old program that says social connection is not optional. Ancient humans solved it by walking over to whoever was nearest and starting a wrestling match. You solve it by opening Instagram. Functionally, almost exactly the same thing. Now, here's the part of this story that I think says the most about what ancient humans actually were as people. They made things nobody asked them to make. Not tools, not weapons, not containers, things with no survival function whatsoever. The oldest known example of deliberate art is a zigzag pattern scratched into a freshwater shell found in Java, somewhere between 430,000 and 540,000 years old. Not made by Homo sapiens, made by Homo erectus, our earlier, smaller-brained ancestor who was not supposed to be doing things like this. He did it anyway. Nobody told him to. It didn't help him hunt. It didn't keep him warm. It didn't impress anyone who could further his reproductive interests. He just looked at a shell and thought, I'm going to put a pattern on this. And he did. In Europe, starting around 40,000 years ago, something extraordinary happens in the archaeological record. Suddenly there are cave paintings everywhere. Horses and bison and handprints and geometric shapes, painted in ochre and charcoal on stone walls deep inside caves where no natural light ever reached, where you'd have to carry a torch just to see what you were doing. Someone went deep into a dark cave specifically to make something beautiful that almost nobody would ever see. The Venus figurines start appearing around the same time. Small, carved female figures in ivory and bone and stone, found across Europe from France to Siberia, made by people who had never met each other, and yet arriving at something aesthetically similar. Different enough to be individuals, similar enough to be human. These objects weren't functional, they weren't practical. They were made because someone had time, and something in them needed to make a thing, and so they made a thing. That's not survival behavior. That's not even social behavior in the obvious sense. That's an individual human sitting somewhere with a piece of bone and a sharp stone, spending hours on something that nobody required of them because they wanted to. Hobbies. Ancient humans had hobbies. And one more detail that I find genuinely wonderful. Archaeologists have noted that many stone tools from this period are crafted with far more precision than their function requires. Flint blades that are perfectly symmetrical, axes with edges so finely worked, they'd actually be more fragile in use than a slightly rougher version would be. They were making them beautiful on purpose. They had the concept of craftsmanship. The idea that doing something well, more carefully than you strictly need to, matters for its own sake. A 40,000-year-old stone tool made by someone who cared about the quality of their work. There's something in that that's hard to put into words. Let's also talk about something that sits right at the edge of making things and something else entirely. Counting. There's an object called the Ishango bone, found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, dating to somewhere between 18,000 and 25,000 years ago. It's a baboon fibula, and carved into it are a series of notches arranged in deliberate groups. The notches appear to represent a counting system. Some researchers think it might be a lunar calendar, tracking the phases of the moon across a month. Think about that for a moment. Someone 20,000 years ago, with nothing urgent to do, sat down and started counting, and then kept counting, and then organized the counts, and then possibly realized the counts matched something in the sky. They weren't doing it because anyone asked. They weren't doing it because it helped them hunt. They were doing it because the pattern was there, and something in their brain refused to let it go unexamined. That's curiosity. Raw, unstructured, utterly impractical curiosity. And it is, by the way, the exact same impulse that eventually led to mathematics, astronomy, physics, and every other field of human knowledge that changed the world. It started with someone bored enough to start counting notches on a bone for no particular reason. Boredom, it turns out, might be one of the most productive forces in human history, not despite being useless. Because of it, the brain, denied obvious tasks, starts making its own. When ancient humans ran out of things to make and people to talk to, they went somewhere. Not for a reason, not hunting, not scouting for resources, just to see what was there. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that people regularly explore territory well beyond their immediate needs. They walk to places they've been before just to be there. They climb hills with no strategic value because the view is interesting. The human brain is wired for novelty in a way that's almost embarrassing. New things, new places, new experiences generate a measurable dopamine response. Your brain rewards you for encountering something unfamiliar. That wiring is ancient, which means for most of human history, when someone was bored, they walked somewhere new. Not to do anything specific when they got there, just to see it. They were hiking for no reason, just because. The oldest version of going for a walk to clear your head. And here's where the exploring gets interesting in a way that changed everything. Because occasionally, someone walking somewhere for no reason found something. A river crossing that nobody in the group knew about. A cave that turned out to be perfect shelter. A valley with more game than they'd ever seen. A plant that turned out to have useful properties. The person who was bored enough to wander found resources that the people who stayed home never discovered. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called the explore-exploit trade-off. The basic idea is that any system, an animal, a company, an algorithm, has to balance between exploiting what it already knows works and exploring for things it doesn't know yet. Hunter-gatherer groups that had some members who defaulted to exploration, even pointless-seeming exploration, were better positioned to find new resources when the old ones ran out. Boredom-driven wandering was, in a very real sense, an evolutionary advantage. The people who couldn't sit still and had to go see what was over the next hill, they were annoying to camp with, probably. But they were also the reason the group survived when the hunting got bad. Curiosity as survival strategy. Restlessness as an asset. The caveman who couldn't stop exploring eventually became the species that walked to every continent on Earth and then went to the moon. Not because they had a plan, because they got bored and went to see what was there. Here's the last one, and it is exactly as strange as it sounds. They groomed each other, not metaphorically, physically. Sitting with members of their group and going through each other's hair, removing parasites, cleaning wounds, tending to skin, which sounds deeply unappealing until you learn that grooming in primates triggers the release of endorphins in both the person doing the grooming and the person being groomed. It's genuinely relaxing. It feels good. It builds trust on a neurological level that's very hard to replicate any other way. An ancient human spending an afternoon having their hair slowly and carefully attended to by someone they trusted was not having a bad afternoon. They were having, by the standards available to them, a pretty excellent afternoon. And there's a version of this that survived all the way into recorded history and that we still do today, and that most of us never think about in these terms. Sitting with someone together, not talking necessarily, not doing a task, just being in the same space, present with each other, letting time pass without filling it with anything. We have a word for it now that makes it sound passive. We call it hanging out. But in a world without screens, without music on demand, without anything to look at except each other and the landscape, this was actually an active choice. You were there, fully there, attending to the person next to you, noticing how they breathed, how they held their body, whether something was wrong or right with them today. That's not doing nothing. That's one of the most intimate things two people can do. Modern humans are spectacularly bad at it. We fill every silence. We reach for something. We perform busyness, even when we're technically resting. Ancient humans, with considerably fewer options, were forced into a kind of presence that most of us now have to pay a meditation teacher to learn. They weren't more enlightened. They just had fewer ways to escape the moment. Sometimes that's the same thing. So here's what the full picture actually looks like. A person in 50,000 BC, with nothing urgent to do, would talk, would gossip and tell stories, and listen to stories, would play some game that nobody remembers the rules to anymore, would make something beautiful that served no practical purpose, would count notches on a bone until a pattern emerged, would go somewhere new just to see it, would sit with someone they trusted and let the afternoon pass slowly. None of that sounds like suffering. It sounds, honestly, like a pretty good day. We've added an almost incomprehensible amount of entertainment and stimulation since then. And somehow, the core of what we actually want when we have free time is almost exactly the same. Connection, story, play, making things, going somewhere, being with people who make us feel safe. The technology changed, the need didn't. The next time you're bored and you reach for your phone and then put it down and reach for it again and put it down again and stare at the ceiling for a while, you are doing something your ancestors would recognize instantly. The feeling is exactly the same. They just handled it by carving a perfect spiral into a piece of bone for no reason. Maybe they had the right